Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. You know, when I do these podcasts, I talk about a number of different things, and sometimes I'm giving a male perspective on something. I'll preface it with that, saying, you know, this is a guy's perspective. I talk about things from the perspective of both men and women in the subject. And I'll cover them from the angle of this is where the misunderstandings happen. These are places where when we can have dialogue in this particular area, it might clear up what may be troubling us in terms of the understanding or the perception. And I might even comment on things that you've heard about, but give a little more background on it, and however that lands. When I talk about men, intimacy, and sex, I'm obviously giving my perspective, but what I'm adding to it in terms of content are conversations that I've had, some of my own experience too, but the conversations I've had with men and women on the subject. And, you know, communication obviously is a key to any misunderstandings that you may have. And you have to have the confidence to engage in a conversation, be open to what's being discussed. So And being open means that you're hearing what the other person is saying. You may not have to agree with it, but when you know from the perspective of having heard them say what it is they feel, then you can be in the conversation that they are having with you. And understand the key difference here. Being in the conversation that they are having as opposed to the conversation that you're having in your head about the subject. I think that's real important when it comes to misunderstandings that people have. Because what we tend to do is we tend to have the perception in our head about what's right and wrong, and we want to sell that to the other person and get them to come to our side. Well, that may eventually happen, and it may take a lot of struggle to get there. But I think when you learn to interpret what the other person is saying to you, because you're having a discussion, because in this particular case, in this example that I'm using as an illustration, you're not necessarily agreeing, and we're trying to clear up the misunderstanding. And how do you do that? Well, you have to, in your just collective mind, know that you understand what the other person is saying to you. And in order to be persuasive, at least in your argument to them, you have to at least answer the questions that are in their mind about you, about what you think. Try to find some common ground. You know, that's something that helps bridge miscommunications. But overall, knowing what the other person is saying to you, understanding what they are saying to you, grasping that. And then when it comes to you explaining your point of view, one of the things that I find is important is using the language that the other person can understand. It might be their own words, not so much to use it against them, but when you are learning how they are speaking to you and you use their language to talk to them, I think that helps in the understanding. I mean, it is a tactic, but this is about clarity and clarification and trying to get onto the same page rather than manipulation. You see, that's another side to this. But I'm not talking about manipulation. I'm really talking about reaching a person with your point of view so that you can relate, so that you can be on the same page, so you can clear the air and go on with your lives. So that's just a bit of my philosophy in dealing with misunderstandings. So this thing about men, intimacy, and sex, something that I've heard a lot in my lifetime is when it comes to sex or relationships, let's say, that's all men really want. They just want the relationship for the sex. And here's another one that, tends to get guys in a lot of trouble. And it's when they are in a decidedly monogamous relationship and they have, say, lots of other girlfriends. And I mean women who are friends, not necessarily lovers. And maybe that also. I'll throw that into the understanding. But what happens is, in the understanding and I believe, and the difference of when a woman is talking to a guy about being in a relationship with him, the intimacy for women, and I'm going to use some generalities here, and I can drill it down a little bit later, but the intimacy for women has typically been, you reach her emotions, you reach her heart, and that's with the cards and the flowers and the nice gestures, the sweet words. When you do that, then a woman feels like she's being loved, and the sex will follow. Maybe. But when she feels emotionally connected to you, then the rest tends to follow. Now, the perception on the other side is that, well, what guys do, and in particular when you're doing this, women always say, well, guys, they're in it for the chase. But once the chase is over, then they're no longer interested. That chase being, they make lots of effort, lots of overtures. When they want you, they'll be thoughtful. They'll bring the card. They'll bring the flowers. They'll bring the candy. They'll do all of those things. And then once they get the sex, then they stop doing those things. Now, I'm not going to say that guys don't do those things, because guys have been known to do exactly that. They do the chase, they do the pursuit, and then it drops off. But why does that happen? I think that's the kind of thing that I want to talk about. And women will collectively nod their heads in agreement. Well, it's because he got the sex. Now he's not interested, because once he got the sex, he's not going to work hard for it. Well, there is this, and I want to explain it this way, that it's obviously a lot more complex. Because if that were the only thing that were happening, that all he did was he wanted to do the chase, and then once he got you, he was done, then, why would we have relationships anyway? Because it would seem that that's so against what you're about that you wouldn't want to have a relationship with a guy. I mean, is it the fact that he's a new guy that you might try this over and over and over again, and you keep going on to new partners? And I'm speaking to the women in that case. I don't think so. And, we're all individuals, and we all have our own qualities which make us unique. But I think along the way, there's something that's flawed about the perception that all they want is sex. And we can have this conversation also. It's about what women perceive as intimacy and what guys perceive as intimacy. And whether men are taught what women think or how to understand what women are saying when they speak. I think the reverse also needs to be explained, is what men are thinking when they say certain things. I think what happens is we know what we feel, we just don't do a very good job of articulating what that is. And we tend to fall back into cliches, which are very easy to do. And because of that, we continue to miss the mark on trying to zero in on something that could be very special and very important for both of us. So I'm going to talk about men, intimacy, and sex right after this. Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about men, intimacy, and sex. One of the things that I want to lead this segment off with and saying, to the women that are listening, you are the object of men's affection. And when I say object, I don't mean that in a negative way, in any way, shape, or form. You are their focus. Men desire women, and in all the good ways. I think what happens in so many of these relationships is the conversation is had on two different levels, and we keep missing each other in the conversation. And remember that first segment I was talking about how to use the language of the person you're speaking to so that you could relate to them, relate back to them? Because I can keep saying my language, but if you don't understand what I'm saying, then we're going to keep missing each other. And this is a very important skill to learn, is to be able to speak the language that the person is talking and connect with them. Men have to learn this, women have to learn this. And when we learn to connect with each other in that way, then in essence we are speaking the same language, we're on the same wavelength, and we can begin to really connect in a heartfelt way, and not in a way that just sort of kicks this thing down the road. I mean, it's nice to make peace with your partner. It's a very satisfying thing to do, but it can be a little disconcerting when this whatever is causing us some strife or a crisis seems to keep happening over and over. And this is one way to get clarity. So that having been said, again, and I want to speak to the women because I'm talking about men, intimacy, and sex. I want women to understand that men love you, and for that reason, remember in the first segment I was talking about how during the chase it seems like men make a lot of effort to be with you. They seem to do all the extra special things. And after the chase, and that would be after they've got you, after you've, say, been in this relationship for a while. And for some women, it's if you're doing the boyfriend-girlfriend thing and it turns sexual, then it seems the interest wanes. No, it doesn't. What tends to happen, and this is just part of the understanding, is a lot of guys don't perceive that what we might call romance is actually part of the ongoingness of it. It's part of the relationship. Some guys tend to think, well, you do the romance right up until we become physical, and then at that point, well, she should already understand how I feel about her because look at all the work I did up front to get to this point. And to the guys, women are saying, yeah, you did all that work up to this point, but then it stopped. And see, there's a huge disconnect because the guy he doesn't stop liking you. I'm saying this to the women. He doesn't stop liking you. Yeah, he may have changed something about his behavior in terms of, yeah, he was doing all that romantic stuff. He was investing a lot of time and effort. But to guys, that's like an investment in the bank. He's been putting all of that time and effort into getting to this point, and he wants to get the payoff. He wants to make a lot of withdrawals from that. And when you look at it from that standpoint, you can see he's not being less of a partner to you. He's just working on the investment that he's put in it. You know, guys, to a woman, what has just happened is that you've just stopped investing in the relationship. And I think what we have to learn to do is to say to each other, okay, what do we want? What do we want this to look like? And how are we going to go about doing this? So having that conversation, I think we both want some of the same thing. A guy wants to feel that intimacy is part of the relationship. It's ongoing, that he wants it. And we want to feel like the woman wants to be there also. I mean, I don't think any guy wants to feel like, well, the woman is just giving him pity sex, because that's going to feel kind of hollow and empty. And for what it does to the quality of the relationship, it tends to degrade it a bit. Well, a lot, actually, because that's going to be one of those conversations that it's going to eventually come up. You know, it's being kicked down the road. But understand that the underlying point here was, you know, when guys are doing all of that work on the front half, they're looking to collect on their investment on the second half. And for women want that in an ongoing sense, because their experience is they want to feel loved and appreciated. And I think we all want to feel that in the relationship. And for oftentimes, a man feels loved and appreciated when he's able to be sexual with his partner. And women may not perceive it that way, but that's a very strong draw for a guy. And I mean that in the best way. But as I said, when we're talking about the romance and it being an ongoing part of the relationship, then you really have to have that conversation around, how do we want this relationship to look? What are the components that make this doable, make this romantic, make this... And when you can get that out of the conversation, then it will continue to grow, and it won't feel like a letdown after the act, so to speak. And I'm saying guys have to understand this as well, because what guys tend to do is what guys tend to do. They tend to do things in a very simplistic fashion. They tend to be very linear. And for what that means to a woman, I think that seems as though it's cheap. It seems like he's not really making the effort. No, it's that guys are simplistic because simple works. Maybe not in a relationship standpoint, but simple works. Because when it's too complex, then it's more apt to be something that'll fail, that'll fall apart. And I'll give you a little analogy here, ladies. If you take a simple car that it starts every morning, it's got a battery, it's got a real simple engine in it, it's got brakes, windshield wiper, the very simple car, it'll always get you to where you need to go. Now, the one with all the bells and whistles is a lot more fancy, but there's more that tends to break down. It's got to go to the shop, and if it's real fancy, then you got to take it to a technician to have them fix it. But see the difference here. It's not that we don't like the real fancy, sophisticated car. It's just that there's more problems that come along with it. And by keeping it simple, simple works. Now, if you're on the receiving end of simple, it may seem hollow. But recognize that in terms of being simple, it is reliable. It'll work every time, all the time. What we have to then do is address the man's understanding of the components of a relationship that make it loving, make it endearing, make it successful, make a woman feel like not only she adored and appreciated, but somebody that wants to be intimate. What are those things that make you want to be intimate? And when you have that conversation, so I'm talking to the women, you have to know what that is and to be able to communicate that to the guy. What are those things that really resonate with you? And when he knows it, I mean, you're looking at him, you're telling him these things, then it's not the shot in the dark that all of that work that the guy was doing at the beginning of the relationship, all this effort, all of these, maybe sometimes they seem like gimmicks, but all of that stuff that he was doing at that point in time, which you might have felt some of those things were great, some weren't, or maybe you liked all of it because there was a whole lot of attention paid to you. Be in conversation about that. Don't make it a guessing game, because that's one of the things that really frustrates a guy is when he has to figure it out, has to guess, and he doesn't know. Guys oftentimes don't know that they don't know. They think that they know the answer. They don't realize that they probably should ask. And I think if you are having those kinds of breakdowns in communication, then it's incumbent upon you to speak your part and say, hey, we're missing this. Because guys don't know all the answers. They think they do, but they don't. I'm going to touch on that when I come back after this. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm John Johnson, talking about men, intimacy, and sex. And I ended up with talking about how men think they know the answers to things. And a lot of times the reason is realize that they are a sum of their collective experiences. And they try what they believe works in any given situation. And when it doesn't, a lot of times they keep trying the same thing over and over because, like I said, they believe it works. Some guys have a few more tools in their toolbox. But when you as a partner, and I'm talking to the women, when you as a partner are seeing that, this guy is trying something, don't just leave him hanging, especially if it's missing the mark. Speak up. Let him know. Something else that, and I'm going to speak from a guy's perspective, that tends to throw this thing into a spin, and sometimes a tailspin. And it's something that doesn't get acknowledged often enough, but it's from the guy's perspective that the woman changes her mind or becomes very, very difficult to read. Difficult to read her intentions, difficult to read her thoughts, what she wants. And what that does to a guy is it makes him wonder, what's going on here? Maybe she's just going through something, and I'm just going to wait this out. So I'm just going to kind of, wait in the stands there. And when all of the dust settles, then I'll venture back out there and give it a shot. And by dust settling, a lot of times it means, I'll wait till she's finished being mad. Because whatever it is that she's mad about, it'll change. And this may be a good opportunity for you to see what's in the mirror here, because we're obviously dealing with the guy's perception is that you switch back and forth, and it's a good time to reflect on that. Maybe you are somebody that's temperamental, and he might be afraid to say it, knowing that if I say something like that, it's going to upset her. But that's one of those critical conversations we need to have, or at least we need to learn to be able to have conversations in this relationship about touchy things, and that we are on the same side. I know they may sound like gripe sessions, and obviously messaging is really, really important here, because none of this is to be an opportunity to take strikes at your partner. But we have to learn how to clear the air so that we can grow this relationship and be good partners. So it doesn't just seem like, it's always a booty call for the guy, or at least to the woman. It's just a booty call. He doesn't really care about me. And in the guy's perspective, he's like, well, I'm having to work awful hard to get that part of the relationship when I've done everything I feel like I know how to do. I try to keep it simple. I try to stay out of trouble. I try not to upset her. And like I said, for some men, that means kind of sitting on the sidelines waiting for the dust to settle. The simple thing for men, and I'm going to say this to women, is tell them what you want. Ladies, tell the man what you want, because then he can be on a task. He can be on the mission to get it done. You might say, well, I didn't have to do that before. Maybe not. Especially in the beginning of the relationship, there was that driver was, the chemistry. We're getting to learn about each other. And I think that part, it was mutual. It wasn't just the guy's interest, but I think the guy knew that you were interested as well. So you made the input, and it was easier to read you because you were making the overtures as well. You were making input. And, that's like driving down the highway and you see the lines. You know where your lane is because you see the lines on the pavement. But when you quit giving input, then we no longer see the lines on the highway, and we're all over the place. And that can be exhausting mentally and emotionally. To that end, and I'm going to talk a bit about this. And, men get a lot of criticisms for having lots of girlfriends. Now, when you got a primary relationship, you speak on that. If you're talking about you're supposed to be monogamous, then, you really have to honor your deal. But one of the things that I have noticed about men is men obviously like intimacy as much as women do. But quite often, men don't understand themselves well enough to be able to put that into place. And by putting it into place, I mean this, understanding it from this perspective. When women want intimacy, it does not necessarily equate to sex. I can use the word romance here. It's the things that aren't sexual. It's the time being spent. It's the feeling like you're special. Maybe it's a card or a note. Maybe it's the acts of kindness, the acts of service, words of affirmation. Those are some of the things that women like. Think about love languages. It fits that realm. And when guys don't receive that from, let's say, a woman who is, they're most wanting that from, they're going to backfill that a lot of times. Some guys have it in their mindset that they will have other women friends that will do this. And they may not be sexual friends. I think what happens is when guys supplement their relationship, their primary relationship with these other women, it's about feeling connected to the woman when there is that void in their own relationship. And they may not even know it themselves. And this is something that has happened time and time again for men. A lot of those relationships become sexual because it is filling a void. It's sort of, that's the direction that the relationships go. And some don't. There's no straight line to that. It just, when you feel close, remember how, and I'm talking to the women, remember how when the guy was pursuing you, or at least spending the time, he maybe not necessarily actually been thinking of it as a pursuit, but he was spending the time. Whether we were talking about things that were important to you, whether you were driving somewhere, doing things together. It could be shopping. It could be talking about things that happen in your family, someone who listens to you, someone who has a nurturing ear for you, for your concerns, for your matters, that kind of quality time, and I want to qualify that, it's quality time, makes you feel close. It makes you feel intimate. But when you're no longer doing that, and sometimes guys don't recognize that that's really what they're looking for. What they think they're looking for is sex. But what they're actually looking for is that kind of intimacy that's not sexual. It's that emotion being filled, that emotion of feeling important, feeling significant, feeling special. Oftentimes guys take that straight line to sex because a lot of them feel like that's what they're wired to do. And they have to be coached a little differently, spoken to in a different way. There's a lot of hormones driving this, but that's something they have to learn to understand, to experience, that there is a lot of satisfaction in this other part to this. But again, and I want to really emphasize this to women, because a lot of women don't believe or don't understand this about men, whether they believe it or not. If you don't understand it, then you can't get your mind around it. What is that? Guys do appreciate something. They appreciate being respected, being honored. And when that happens, that's another way to a guy's heart. It's sex makes a guy feel good, and I can tell you this from my own personal experience. When I have been asked my opinion on something, not being told what to think, but actually asked what I feel, my opinion, by my partner, then I feel special. I feel appreciated. I feel considered. And those are all things that are important. I mean, sure, I'm the guy that knows how to fix things. I can grab the screwdriver or the hammer or the nails, whatever needs to be fixed. I obviously know how to do that. And I've been the go-to guy for lots of my friends. And I can tell you personally, I get a lot of satisfaction out of that. I love helping. Acts of service, that's one of my love languages. And utilizing this knowledge I have to fix things and it really makes me feel special. And I like people seeing that somebody cares about it and gives a quality job, the whole thing. I spent a lot of my life in a hardware store, so I know about all the aisles and the tools and things that can be there. So that's my specialty. And many guys have that same thing. And there is nothing sexual about that. But when that part isn't present, meaning that feeling of being special to your partner, then what guys tend to fall into is they tend to fall into these situations that lend themselves to be important to someone else. And I'll use the hardware store analogy. Guy sees a woman in the hardware store, and the woman asks for help, and man, you'll see guys wanting to run over there and give her a hand. And they'll walk right past the man who could use the help as well. Because guys like to feel helpful to women. I mean, they'll help the guy. I mean, eventually. They'll get to the guy. But that's how much guys like to be pleasers. And when we talk about intimacy, I know we oftentimes, when we're talking about men, we're oftentimes thinking only about sex. No, in this particular case, it's about being respected. It's about being considered, consulted, that thing. And it really makes a man feel important. So to the women who are listening, one of the ways to a man's heart is just to tell him how much you love and respect him. And I'm going to ask everyone, do you know what your partner's strengths are? For example, is he good with tools? Is he a good organizer? Is he good with money? And that being the case, what are some of the examples in the relationship where he's utilized those skills and you could see a benefit from it? If you want to make an observation about your partner that's really going to make them feel good in the relationship, point those things out to them. And it shows that you notice. It shows that you're paying attention. And then on the back half of that, if you have a request, keep it simple, but he'll do it. And he'll do it because he feels loved, respected, appreciated. I mean, he'll go out of his way for you. And I know sometimes, some guys aren't really good at all the man things you might want them to be good at. Maybe your neighbor's husband is better at fixing fences or something. Well, maybe your guy doesn't have that particular skill, but he's got something that he's good at that you can appreciate him for. And for what it's worth, here's another thing. Now, this is one of the don'ts, because this usually makes a guy feel pretty deflated when you compare him to your neighbor in a negative way. Take the fence example that I was using as an illustration. Well, if your fence has some issues and your guy's not good at fixing fences, but you tell him, well, so-and-so across the street, he's really good at fixing fences. Why can't you be like him? Ooh, you see. Now, that sort of comparison makes a guy bristle because it makes him feel as though it's an unfair comparison. I mean, if your guy has never been one to fix fences and the guy across the street is a fencing contractor, well, there's no contest. And guys face those issues all the time in their own self-confidence. So if they lack confidence and you're pulling examples like that out of the air, that's really going to shoot him down. And the thing that he's going to do is he's going to look for validation and reinforcement. And it may be inappropriate validation and reinforcement. But you can't shoot him down like that and think that there won't be consequences, at least to his heart. Men will oftentimes come back feeling resentful and maybe bitter and angry at those kind of comparisons because it really shoots down their masculinity. Like I say, men have many insecurities. And the thing that we don't want to do is have the woman who's in our life make us feel as though we're inadequate. So be careful about those kinds of comparisons. But what I want to end by saying is learn the language that your partner is speaking, and that will help when you're talking to each other. And communication isn't just about saying words back and forth, but it's also more about having a deeper understanding. So learn each other's language. Learn how to build each other up. And understand that for men, they get billed for intimacy equaling sex. That's a component. Men are definitely emotional creatures. They like feeling important, special, and validated. And they also understand that that is a two-way street. They know it's important to make you feel important and special. So tonight's an opportunity to go talk to your partner about how you feel and learn to talk the language that you both can understand. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.